You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hi, I'm Doug. Scott Callaham is back with me again, and we're talking more about the infinitive absolute in Biblical Hebrew. Dr. Scott Callaham, thanks for joining us for another session exploring the uses of the Biblical Hebrew infinitive absolute.
It's great to be back. Thanks for having me once again.
Yes, sir. Well, we certainly appreciate the overview you gave us in the previous episode where you talked about your dissertation research, the motivations for that, and gave us a teaser of a lot of the practical payoff of it. And I wondered on this episode if we could just work through some of the categories that you noted, like the independent use, the paronomastic use, maybe in the use when you see a negation before or after an infinitive absolute, things like that. If you just walk us through some of those sorts of examples, and we'll talk about what students and scholars will see in the Bible.
Okay, let's do it. That's a good resource right there.
Yeah, I've got this wonderful resource here. And even though, this particular form is not found in biblical Aramaic, right?
That's right. So we don't have an infinitive absolute in biblical Aramaic, but it bears mentioning that the infinitive absolute was present in Old Aramaic, meaning before the time that it became a Jewish language. There are examples of the infinitive absolute in Aramaic and also other Semitic languages.
Right. And although this is designed as an Aramaic grammar, it is a side-by-side Hebrew and Aramaic. So it's always relating the grammatical concepts of the two languages. And it's so useful in that. So I'm turning in the chapter on the infinitive, past now the infinitive construct, since we're focusing on the infinitive absolute. And the first thing I see here is an independent use of the infinitive absolute. You referenced that in our last interview, but could you recap and talk about an example of that?
Right. So the independent use of the infinitive absolute, this is when it looks like the infinitive absolute is substituting for a finite verb. And what usually is the way that a teaching grammar in Hebrew will address this kind of use is splitting it up into categories, like the use of the infinitive absolute in place of an imperative. And then the other examples of it substituting for finite verbs actually may not get mentioned, but there are times when it's very obvious that we have, from a form standpoint, that must be an infinitive absolute, but it's standing in for some other finite verb, not an imperative. So it appears from a linguistics standpoint that what is happening here is simply the infinitive absolute substituting for a finite verb, and the imperative is just one kind of finite verb. So it's not some other use, it's just that happens to be the finite verb that the infinitive absolute is substituting for. So an example of this for the infinitive absolute is the so-called positive commands in the Ten Commandments. So remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy is zakur. So that's the call infinitive absolute, okay?
Right. It's not an imperative.
That's right.
In its form, yeah.
That's right. And then the so-called negative commands, the prohibitions in the Ten Commandments, well, those can't be imperatives because that needs to be low with an imperfect. So there are actually no imperatives in the Ten Commandments. Now, I say that if a viewer were to use any Bible software right now and search, they would hit some imperatives in the Ten Commandments. I assert that the honor your father and mother commandment, which normally that kaved verb shows up as PL infinitive, imperative masculine singular, is actually an infinitive absolute, which would be spelled exactly the same.
Okay.
It's just that the Westminster Hebrew morphology that underlies your Logos, your Accordance, your Bible Works, whatever your software package is, has always, to this point at least, identified these words as imperatives when by context, I suggest that context should override that because we have an unmistakable Call infinitive absolute with Zakor.
Right.
So, in parallel, we'd expect a parallel use. It's a PL infinitive absolute for honor your father and your mother. So
this is a good moment to pause and just mention that relying on Bible software can be hazardous, right? Because somebody has gone through and parsed and tagged those things. There can be mistakes, errors in judgment, or even just errors in tagging there. I really would like to see more cases like this where they say, some think it's this, some think it's that. But a lot of times you'll bring it up and it's just going to give you one option there. But you need to know how to find out.
That's true. And actually, as an aside, this is something I bring up occasionally on Daily Dose of Aramaic, where I'll hit upon a parsing that is incorrect in whether it's the Westminster Hebrew morphology for the Hebrew Bible or the analysis that underlies most Aramaic text, which is the Comprehensive Aramaic Lexicon Project. So I recorded an episode recently where the Comprehensive Aramaic Lexicon analysis was wrong on a Targum Pseudo-Jonathan word, where it was correct on onkelos, and I verified it with Dr. Stephen Kaufman. He's like, nope, you're right on that. The thing is that story and my interactions with the good people at the Westminster Hebrew Morphology Project,
right.
It underlines that this is a human-generated database. And if one day we get to where we could have AI check these things, the AI can be wrong too.
Yes.
Right. So this is a reason right now to say this is why we need people to be trained in biblical languages, to be able to have the critical thinking ability to look at the text and go, you know what, this commentator is wrong on this particular subject. And, just like the critical thinker, can be wrong as well.
Right.
But if we apply our critical thinking, if we apply our training, we're in this interpretive task together. And then we can critically evaluate each other's assertions about the biblical text. So that's, that's a little discourse there on the independent use of the infinitive absolute.
Yeah, that was a great, I think, helpful aside, though, that people need to hear, especially in an age where we're seeing schools push these Hebrew tools courses as substitutes, but there's not a substitute for learning the languages.
Well, I can go off on that, right? Because, for instance, we at the Institute of Public Theology believe that we really need engagement with the world as it exists right now. Hence the Public Theology and Institute of Public Theology. And so a person might say that should lead to the dropping of biblical languages because that's a classical discipline. That is what people used to do. We need theology for now. But see, the thing is, theology for now comes from the Bible. The problem with most theology for now is that it doesn't come from the Bible. So we need greater biblical fidelity. So that's why I'm pleased at the Institute of Public Theology, we teach Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek as our standard for our Master of Divinity. Anyway, thanks for letting me have a brief moment to go off on that. We could have a whole episode.
Yes, yeah, maybe we will one day. That would be worthwhile.
Yes. Talking about going down the road of doing the tools course is a road to disaster for biblical interpretation. So independent uses of the infinitive absolute. So, one kind we find in Proverbs 25:27, eating much honey is not good, where eating is akol, it's a kal infinitive absolute. So eating is the subject of that sentence. It's functioning as a noun, verbal noun, So that is a relatively rare use, but there you can say that is an infinitive absolute, unmistakably by its pointing, that is functioning just as a noun. And then other than the famous Exodus 20, verse 8, Zakor, remember the Sabbath day that I had mentioned earlier, we could turn to Ecclesiastes 9:11, where we see, again, I saw under the sun, where ra'o there is a kal infinitive absolute. So this is kind of like, I suppose it could be a katal or a vayiktol, where it's, by context we see it's a past tense. And so here you have this infinitive absolute. What do you do with it? It happens to have a conjunction in front of it in Ecclesiastes 9:11. But that's just a clear example of standing in for some finite verb. Now, you get, just as an aside, a person might say, well, this is a Hebrew only thing. Does this show up in, like what do translators do with the infinitive absolute? Well, generally, these independent uses don't cause a problem, because by context, say the Greek translator, the ancient Aramaic translator, the ancient whatever, Latin would say, oh, that's like an imperative, and that's how they would render it. So these substitutions for finite verbs don't tend to cause a translation issue. It's when we get to the paronomastic uses that it's interesting, as we mentioned in our previous episode.
When you mentioned Dr. Kim's dissertation on the tautological infinitive, is that the same idea as a paronomastic infinitive?
Yes. So that's,
okay.
I think, that's a long-standing, paronomastic infinitive construction is a long-standing technical term, as is tautological infinitive. So he chose to use that one for his dissertation. It's the same thing. Tautology implies something is said which doesn't need to be said.
Like they have equivalent meaning, where paronomasia has to do with the sound of it. Yes.
Yeah, but see, the thing is, I don't want to imply that there's no meaning conveyed, because if it's truly not needed, why would it be said?
Right.
So, paronomastic implies paronomasia wordplay. Well, there may not be wordplay. so it's troubling that we have a lack of completely self-explanatory, persuasive terminology here.
Sure.
That we can all unite under. But yes, the paronomastic use, since that's what I used in my dissertation, that's what I used in Biblical Aramaic for Biblical Interpreters, to talk about the infinitive absolute. And the reason why it's brought up in the Aramaic textbook is what you said. I give a comprehensive review of Hebrew, and this is a facet of Hebrew, so it needs to be reviewed. And it's interesting, the infinitive absolute appears in Hebrew Daniel, but not in Aramaic Daniel. So, I mean, this is a literary unit where when it's expressed in different languages, it appears that there are times when it really could have helped to have an infinitive absolute in the Aramaic of Daniel, but it's not there. So, the other main category is the paronomastic use.
Right. So what would you say about that paronomastic use? That's the one where people are prone to just inserting surely and things like that, right?
Yes. So one variant, which is less common, is the kind in Isaiah 19:22. The Lord will strike Egypt, striking. So that's the repetition of the cognate finite verb, and healing. So you have two infinitives absolute, one of which matches the cognate finite verb. And this is communicating simultaneous action. So in the Lord's striking of Egypt, there's healing at the same time. Strange, very strange, right? And it actually, in comparison with other passages, is more strange, because you just don't expect healing to happen at the same time as striking. It's part of the agenda of that oracle against the nations directed to Egypt. And so it's beautiful how the infinitive absolute does something there that we don't have the same way of expressing in English of simultaneous action. But what we're normally talking about is the use of the paronomastic infinitive with just the one cognate finite verb, one infinitive absolute that matches it. So an example here that tends to get the manner adverb is Leviticus 5:19. It is a guilt offering. He has gravely offended the Lord, where gravely would be the contribution of the infinitive absolute in translation. So the infinitive absolute can only express by its form the verb idea. The question is, what is it doing? And I don't think that it is correct to say that it's an adverb. Because of the linguistic domain it's in, that would be a strange transformation to go over to adverb territory. I think it's what it appears to be, which is a copy of the finite verb root, so to speak, because we don't do roots in English the same way, right? Of the root stripped of person, gender, number, tense, aspect, modality to focus the verb. So in the case of Leviticus 5:19, if the best we can do is the manner adverb gravely, to say offense, so let's focus offense. Well, how do we focus offense? Gravely. That kind of idea. Really offended
Mhm.
the Lord. So that's the manner adverb kind of thing. And we've already talked about Genesis 2:16, from any tree in the garden
Yes.
may eat. Well, the next expression there is why? Well, because in the day you eat of it, you will die. Well, so we have a question here of should we say surely for you will? I think that we need to step back from being so eager to put surely in when we're dealing with potential. Because that example that I gave from Leviticus 5:19, the offense has happened. It's in the world of fact. It's not in the world of potential. He has gravely offended the Lord. But when we're talking about the world of potential, we are distorting or wiping clean the modality when we put in surely. So I'm not sure, I'm not certain that we want to put in surely in cases of you will surely die, but instead, whatever tactic we've used for other modality, we do for the surelys, so to speak. So from any tree in the garden you may eat, if we go with bolding that in the text,
Mhm.
let's bold, you will surely die. You will die. Instead
Right.
of reflexively saying surely. Because the thing is, to the English reader or other modern language reader, it sounds like, well, that's not true. They don't die, right? So there's more going on, we know, theologically, in saying you will die when you eat of it, because the human couple does eat of the fruit and they live a long time physically
Right.
after that. So what happened? How does that relate? Well, if we
Right.
step back from surely, we have a little bit of help, right? And
Certainly.
then,
Yes.
one more thing you mentioned is about negation. And this is important. So this appears on Biblical Aramaic for Biblical Interpreters, page 176. And I have to refer to my work because, well, I've done more work on the infinitive absolute than many, but also the relationship between negation and the infinitive absolute I didn't work on a lot in my dissertation book, and it was needed in Biblical Aramaic for Biblical Interpreters because here I'm supplying in the infinitive construct its parallels with the Biblical Aramaic infinitive and negation I mentioned, right? And so here I want to mention negation. I want to do the same thing. And what I discovered is that some research has suggested that if the infinitive absolute falls within the scope of the negation, meaning the word order scope. So the negator has appeared first, for example, in the infinitive absolute next, and the cognate verb. Well, it's everything that's getting negated. That is Snyman's assertion in the scope of the negative low in Biblical Hebrew. Whereas if the infinitive absolute should appear outside of that word order scope, where the negator appears after the infinitive absolute, then it's only the finite verb that's getting negated. I think it's only possible to say that if you assume, as it appears to me Snyman does, that the infinitive absolute's an adverb. But it's not. See, that's the thing. So
Right.
it's not just my opinion. I cite research here. But if the infinitive absolute in an apeiromastic situation is a copy of the finite verb that is meant to bring about verb focus, you can't be talking about negation not applying to it. And how would you negate something like that anyway? It's just a verb idea. On the page, it's a verb idea. How do you negate that? And how would that be expressed differently, negating that, or sorry, not negating that, but only negating the cognate finite verb? It makes much more sense to recognize that what we have here is a movable copy that, depending on other syntactical, grammatical constraints, can appear in a different place. So an example that looked at in my dissertation book is the so-called post-positive paronomastic infinitive. So normally the infinitive absolute comes before the verb. And so we had talked about, I think in our previous interview, about the verb fronting before itself.
Right.
to focus the verb, and that's done with the prepositive infinitive absolute. So what about when the infinitive absolute comes after the cognate finite verb? Well, in these cases, we have other constraints which have placed it there. And I think
Right.
by doing my modality placed study, I think I've demonstrated that there's not a statistical difference, an interpretive difference even, between the pre-positive and post-positive, and we're dealing with the mechanics of the language as to the best slot to put this copy in. So if that's true, as far as negation goes, there's not a difference of what the negation is doing, where that falls. And here's an interesting fact. There is no example of negation of the infinitive absolute when it's functioning as finite verb. Ooh. Okay. So when it's standing alone, it's never negated.
Okay.
So it seems like that when we've got that paronomastic use, it's just this bare idea that is saying, look over there at that verb. So whatever applies to that verb, whatever modality it has, whatever negation or lack thereof it has, pay attention to that. So I think that's kind of important for taking the infinitive absolute rightly in our interpretation.
Right. Well, you mentioned 2:16 there earlier, and that makes me immediately think of chapter 3 of Genesis, verse 4, when the serpent says, "Lo mot timotun," and just takes that same finite verb plus the infinitive absolute, but you've got the negation on the front of it. So he's saying that same modality, but just in the negative, saying,
Yes.
right?
Yes. So we struggle to do this in English. You won't really die. Is that what it means? You know, where that if we do that, it takes away from the verbal correspondence between the two. Straight from God, you will die. You won't die.
Right.
So it's even more bald-faced contradiction when you see it's exactly the same. I mean, it has to be done differently because of the negation, but I mean, like, it is the same expression that it's just negated. Ooh. It's good to point that out.
And that's where we go for our theology, right?
Well, we should go to grammar and syntax as well as the greater literary context. And kind of a cool thing about this episode in Genesis 2 and 3 is that I found that, say, Von Rad and Reverend Childs and others have pointed out these kind of insights about, look, there's really a magnanimous permission here about all these trees in the garden. It's not you have permission to eat freely, like the eating thing, but it's you may eat. Permission is the point. But they really didn't have a linguistic reason they gave. It was more of the gut feel reason.
Right.
So as much as we can, we want to depend on objectively what's in front of us. And it just so happened that the gut feel was right in those cases.
Certainly, in all this, we're just going back as much as we can to the text and seeing what's right there. Okay, these are great examples looking at the text here, and I'm sure folks are seeing that this is important to think about as we do this. I'm curious, though, Scott, in your research, I pulled up the infinitive absolute in my Accordance Bible software, and I saw it listing about 294 different forms. I didn't go through all of those extensively, but I noticed that it had a lot of instances, for example, of mot to die, of halak to go or walk, and so forth. Do you see certain patterns with certain, not only maybe just certain lexemes, but just certain kinds of verbs? Anything you would comment on there?
Well, we've already said that we expect infinitives absolute to appear more often in discourse, reported speech in the Bible. And so that's where, our mind immediately goes, you will die. So the mot verb, that is going to get said by God to his people. And so that's where we would expect these to show up. We don't expect non-discursive poetry so much. So, there will be these kind of examples. I think that's, it's very interesting to see what kind of verbal roots we'll use the infinitive absolute frequently, as you have pointed out. It is probably just what those roots are conveying that lends themselves to this dramatic verb focus that one can achieve with the paronomastic infinitive absolute. And the thing about we need to think critically about our Bible software use, right?
Yes.
We would want to construct a search that would be tailored to what we're actually trying to find out. So we would want to look at, okay, as far as independent infinitives absolute go,
Yes.
which roots show up the most for that use? As far as the paronomastic uses that are not simultaneous action ones, which verbal uses show up the most. So there would need to be a more refined study to say,
Sure.
Look at this. These verbs tend to show up a lot in the infinitive absolute in these situations, and maybe not some others, and then say, well, that certainly makes sense from the standpoint of what kind of literature we're looking at.
Right. What about the verbal stems? I noticed there too, and again, allowing for the complexities of how we construct our searches and so forth. I noticed 518 of the 893 hits I got were in the call stem, 226 in the hifil, 110 in the PL, 29 in the nifal, 7 in the hofal, 2 in the hit pile, and 1 in the pual. So
Yes.
I'm wondering here, is there a pattern here? I mean, I'm seeing a lot of things with what we might consider active and not so much with the passive. Is there something there?
Right. Well, first off, the kind of statistics we can find with that kind of search sort of just on the face of it demonstrate that, just how the verbal stem system works in the Semitic languages, where you have the base stem and derived stems.
Yes.
Where they derive from and usually receive their meaning through comparison with the base stem. Usually, So some verbal roots, the nifal is the base stem, the base meaning. So that doesn't apply in that case. But that's just the general big idea of how the stem system works. And so there's a preponderance in the call, and there are even cases where you have the call infinitive absolute. We're talking about the paronomastic use right now, paired with, say, a nifal, cognate finite verb. So what we have there is sort of what we would expect if that infinitive absolute is doing what I say it does of verb focus, where it's not the point. It's directing reader attention through verb focus toward the finite verb, in this case, that nifal.
Right.
And there's this stem mismatch that does take place sometimes. I mean, usually it's the same stem. Call infinitive absolute, call finite verb together. So you do have that. That's an observation to make. And of course, the preponderance of active voice is sort of what we'd expect. We would need to look more at the nifal for it, like it's a nifal, but what voice is it really? Meaning, is this the base idea for this particular verb type? But we would expect much more active voice because of just the nature of what tends to happen with verb focus.
Right.
Because
so that's
in active voice, the subject is doing the action. In passive voice, the subject is receiving the action.
Right. Well, and this is a good reminder too, again, with the searches, not just look for the stems, but see what they're doing in combination with those other things. So like what you're saying with the call plus a nifal, the finite verb, you would just have the basic stem, the call, in order to just say, look at that nifal, right? That we're just going to point to that. So, okay. Well, what about, our focus here obviously has been on biblical Hebrew, and we mentioned that it does occur outside of biblical Aramaic and older Aramaic, but what about other Semitic languages? Is the infinitive absolute or something like it attested in other cognates?
Yes. So just some examples. Right here, I don't know if the viewership is familiar with Reiner Dagen's Old Aramaic grammar. So I bring this up because this is before Aramaic became a Jewish language. So this is a grammar of the 10th to the 8th centuries BC. So this Old Aramaic had productive infinitives absolute. So, for instance, the infinitive absolute appears in this paronomastic use on the Saphire stele, for instance. So that's interesting. This is a pan-Semitic feature, which it appears before other Semitic language branches lost its function in Aramaic. However, just before we move on to these other cognate languages, something that's interesting to me, in Daily Dose of Aramaic, we have been walking through the Targums. So Targum Onkelos, and I'm recording Targum Pseudo-Jonathan right now. Well, because of what the Targums are trying to do, they're trying to provide a translation, which it's possible to actually find the word-for-word translation from Hebrew. They mimic the Hebrew infinitive absolute with Aramaic, with an infinitive, including in the pa'al form, which is the base verb form, having a different vocalization. Interesting. Beyond that pa'al, beyond the base form, it's the same vocalization for just the regular infinitive use in Aramaic, but there still is the mimicking, the paronomastic use that then the Aramaic infinitive is pressed into that service at that time. So that's just an interesting dynamic in Targumic Aramaic, that a means of saying something that did exist in the language in previous days is brought back to be literalistic in translation of Hebrew. Okay, what about other Semitic languages? Well, some of our viewers may be familiar with the Mesha stele, which is this black artifact found in 1868 in what is Jordan today, but it used to be Moab, which was a proclamation by King Mesha, and it gives you the background of this battle that appears in 2 Kings chapter 3 from the Moabite perspective. Well, here you have a non-Jewish writing. So this is an enemy of Israel. It's talking about defeating Israel forever, this kind of thing. Well, this idea, Israel is utterly destroyed forever, is rendered with a call infinitive absolute in partnership with the call finite verb of the aleph, beit, dalet, the sort of destroy or perish verbary in Moabite. So there you have an artifact of Moabite, and it's our main artifact of Moabite, which cannot have Hebrew influence. So I just talked about what does have Hebrew influence, the Targums. What cannot have Hebrew influence, they're the enemy of Israel. They would not want to have Hebraisms, right, in their official inscription announcing the defeat of Israel. Well, there you have it, absolute. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
So infinitives absolute appear, for instance, in Ugaritic, that alphabetic cuneiform language. So this is a common Semitic trait that sort of becomes famous for us because it's a feature of biblical Hebrew. And we need to try to struggle to find a way to render it in ways that make sense in our modern languages, because I don't know of any modern language, including Semitic ones, that have a productive infinitive absolute, because the infinitive absolute, I'm no expert on modern Hebrew, but is not present as a productive feature of modern Hebrew. Meaning, use of the infinitive absolute now, such as in a paronomastic use, would be for a dramatic archaizing effect.
Right.
Because an educated Israeli can make sense of the Hebrew Bible and will come across these infinitives absolute. So he or she has seen these. And so if a modern Israeli wanted to use the paronomastic infinitive absolute, it would be understood, right? But it's not what's normal for modern Hebrew, because there are features of biblical Hebrew like the Vayikol that are not present in modern Hebrew. So these are just some observations about related languages that are in the Semitic language family. And since we don't have the infinitive absolute in modern languages, it just increases the urgency of knowing what's going on here. We don't have a structural equivalent.
Yes, that's right. Well, we really are indebted to you for this work, Scott. And one thing I wanted to ask about with the grammars, though, you've produced this. Dr. Kim's produced his work. There's been advances in the field. Have the resources for teaching students, have they caught up with that? Are there some that are incorporating this kind of research? I've noticed this in some other areas too. One of my readers, for instance, did work on the NIFL, and I will read grammars that just obviously are not conversant with the latest research on it. What about the infinitive absolute?
Yes. Well, the second edition of a biblical Hebrew reference grammar, led by Fonder Mavra, he does reference both my work and Yuki Kim's work in the infinitive absolute treatment. In the years leading up to the second edition coming out, he had actually sent me an earlier draft, and we had corresponded because he did a lengthy review article of both of our books. And he actually had a misunderstanding of something that of something in my book that I was able to, correct for him. At an earlier stage in a biblical Hebrew reference grammar coming to its second edition, it was actually far more influenced by my work. So there was kind of a pulling back, I think, to make it cohere a bit more with the first edition's treatment, rather than radically overhauling the treatment of the infinitive absolute in the modality direction. So, there may have been a decision to do that based on just trying to cohere with other treatments, such as Takemitsu Muraoka's or Gesenius or something like that. But, so there's a quick answer. That reference grammar includes it, and then the Arnold and Choi, more outline-like syntax reference grammar. Well, so that also interacts with this research. I have not seen it to this point in teaching grammars, which has been, I've wanted to see it, but the problem with incorporating sort of this higher level research into a teaching grammar, on the other hand, is that you need to always keep focus on your teaching and the level that you're teaching and bringing the student along.
Right.
But what I mean about incorporating it is I want to not see Shirley being this reflex of dropping Shirley in because of the reasons we've discussed, that just takes modality out of the picture, and modality is inherent in verbs. So even in languages like Chinese that have no modifications of their verb whatsoever, modality is an active concept and it's in the scope of the verb. It just has to be studied differently than morphologically. So modality is in the scope of biblical Hebrew verbs, and it appears that when the verb is focused, that's what the infinitive absolute is doing, is accenting that to the modality. So I just don't want to see Shirley anymore. It's still out there. So it's just something that has to be addressed as we move into the future. Maybe one day we'll see Bible translations that don't reflexively have Shirley.
Right. And teaching grammars that nuance this a little more. But, that's one of the challenges, isn't it? Because when you're teaching and producing things for beginning students especially, you have to simplify. You have to scaffold. You have to isolate things at times. But my concern, I don't think it's always communicated to students at times that that's what's going on. That I like to say in some of my teaching, like, I'm teaching you the training wheels version. Don't take this out of here and apply it to everything. There's more nuance to it here. But I think a lot of students take 1 year or one semester of Hebrew or Greek, and they will take something there and they will say, oh, that's what I learned there, and now I'm going to use that in my sermons. Now I'm going to use that in a translation or something like that. And I think we need to do our due diligence and tell students, hey, there's more to this, but let's get started here.
Right. And how would you explain best in a teaching grammar some sort of remnants of earlier stages of Hebrew that show up sometimes, like the preterite use of yiktol? That's mind-blowing. After you've spent so much time getting people to be trained up on, say, the vayiktol, here you have this yiktol that's doing the vayiktol's job. How is that possible? It's mind-blowing. It's the kind of thing that we need. We need good teachers, so when the question comes up, that it can be addressed, and good teachers for our Hebrew exegesis. And it's actually a reason to remind school administrators that merely having a grammar year in studying the biblical languages is not going to do the job. We need exegesis training, and it's very difficult to cram that into the grammar year.
Yes.
Just from the standpoint of, look at the long-term benefit of putting in the hard work now and not loading the learning burden onto the initiative of the already busy student.
Yes.
Who, when this person goes out into the ministry or academic world, you know, like your systematic theology PhD, he's not going to study more Hebrew, right? When he or she is drawing on biblical passages in Hebrew, you'd want that person to have had exegesis class. Strikingly absent from most programs.
Yes. Yeah, let's stop this trend of reductionism of the languages.
Right.
Let's give them everything we can here, and so they can take this with them. Well, there's and there's as we wind up our interview here today, and I really appreciate it. It's been so productive to talk about these matters with you, Scott. There's just so much payoff just for scholars and researchers, professors, students, but then this exegetical payoff, as we talked about, being able to responsibly use Bible software and the commentaries as well. Just any closing reflections there on, where the rubber meets the road, as it were, with, at the end of the day, why do we care about this?
Well, the this in your sentence, I think, is Hebrew. Why do we care about the biblical languages? I mean, certainly we should all care about the infinitive absolute, right?
Yes, yes.
More importantly, what's the big picture here? Well, the big picture is we want accurate understanding of the biblical text for teaching and preaching, because we understand in our modern era, most people in our churches, in our circles, are not going to have access to the biblical languages. And they are going to read commentaries. They're going to hear fantastical claims online and elsewhere. And how will they know if they're right? We need good teaching. And, an example just of this real quick is, until recently, I have never heard a claim based on biblical Hebrew grammar in a sermon that has been correct. 100% of the time, until recently, the chain is broken. But until recently, and it's not my sermon, it's my pastor here, Tom Askell. Until that sermon, and I told him he broke the chain, I had never heard a correct claim from Hebrew grammar. It's always been wrong. So that's bad. Okay.
Yes.
And that says something about just sort of the standard level of Hebrew knowledge among people who are entrusted to be the main interpreters of the word for churches. And,
Right.
That's before getting into other fields in theological studies. So you want the New Testament guy to have a good basic command of Hebrew and Aramaic, and you want the theology guy as well, church history and so forth. Sure. Mm-hmm. Just as they would want us to know about their fields pretty well.
Yes.
The biblical languages deserve our attention, because if we believe that the biblical text is conveying something that's worth knowing, why not squeeze every bit of truth out of it we possibly can?
Yes. Amen. Well, Scott, I really appreciate you coming on to talk to us about not only the specialty of the infinitive absolute, but just more generally why we need to be studying the biblical languages.
It's a pleasure, and hope we have many more opportunities to talk like this.
Likewise. Shalom.